You're listening to On Shifting Ground from Commonwealth Club World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. In more than 40 years of covering elections, that's 12 presidential contests, I've learned that it doesn't matter how much you know or how much you think you know about what's going to happen election night. Whether it's access to the latest polls, the inside skinny from party operatives, tips from the most influential journalists, it's impossible to know what's about to happen because none of us know exactly who's going to turn out to cast a vote and what's going through a voter's head on Election Day. Going into the 2024 presidential race, there were fears violence and intimidation might depress the vote, that misinformation might discourage people from casting their vote, or that short-staffed voting sites and long lines at the polls might turn voters away. But according to international election observers, the 2024 election was peacefully and professionally administered. At the end of the day, the democratic process operated the way it should. We can trust the results, and they are clear. Former President Donald Trump defeated Vice President Kamala Harris, and it wasn't close. He will return to the White House in January. Now that we're a few days out from the election, we still don't have all of the data, but compared to the 2020 contest, a huge number of counties swung in favor of the Republicans. Many of those counties that flipped from Biden to Trump were small ones. A few hundred votes here or a few thousand votes there turned blue squares on the map into red ones. The real losses for Kamala Harris came in counties where she still won the majority of votes, but her margin of victory was a smaller one compared to 2020. In large urban suburbs, where President Biden carried 70% of the vote, Harris won 60. Where he won 60, she got 55. It was death by 1,000 cuts, according to Dante Chinni. Dante Chinni is a reporter, data analyst, and director of the American Communities Project at Michigan State University. The American Communities Project is in the middle of a 3-year study of American fragmentation funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. I'm one of the reporters working on the project, so Dante Chinni is kind of my boss. Welcome back to On Shifting Ground.
Thank you, Ray. I consider you a colleague, not a worker. You're a colleague.
Then this is P2P, peer-to-peer. When we last spoke in January, it was clear that the American Communities Project survey work, the numbers you were getting from the field, confirmed that Americans were feeling pretty pessimistic about the 2024 presidential election. Now that we're at the end and we know what happened, were you picking up something that was significant to know about American sentiment?
So, I don't know. I mean, I'm sorry. I'm in the post-election moment of I've just looked at so much data and gone through so many things trying to understand what's going on. I will say we did a second survey this year. We saw immigration rise as a concern among people, and we saw inflation decline, which should have been a good sign for the Harris campaign. But inflation, to be clear, was still at the top. And look, we're going to be debating forever what happened in this election. I understand that. And when I look at it, when I'm looking through the exit poll data, which, by the way, AP VoteCast, which is this massive survey, broke down everything into the American Communities Project types, which we haven't even started going through yet because we've just been drinking coffee. But we'll go through that now, and I think we can really see some differences in there. But I think the thing that I'm seeing in the data is very simply, how do I explain what happened? And Trump has about 47% of the country. He was always going to get 47%. Has been his high watermark. And then inflation gave him an extra 2, 3, 4 points and pushed him over the edge. And honestly, when I look at the data, that's what I see. I do think some of the other things you're saying, though, about pessimism, we saw that in so many ways. We saw it in all these true-false questions we asked people. There is a very, very, very deeply pessimistic vibe in this country right now. And I do think sometimes when people feel like that, they think they want a strong man to come in and kind of take hold and fix things for them. And here we are.
One of the most interesting through lines in your numbers for me, one of the most interesting stories that emerges from that pile of numbers, is that again and again, in so many ways, people say they're doing pretty well while they are convinced everybody else isn't.
Right. I mean, it's really funny because we kind of did a different take on that because we did another survey this year and we asked people about their hopes for the future. And we saw that echoed in those data where you ask people, how do you feel about your individual future? How do you feel about the future for your kids? How do you feel about the future for your community? And the numbers ticked down a little bit, but they were still pretty high when it came to me, the things immediately around me, my kids. And then you ask about the country and straight through the floor. So just a different way of asking, right track, wrong track, really getting to the future of things. And when you ask people about the short-term future of the United States, the long-term future of the United States, are you hopeful or not hopeful? They were not hopeful in any community type. In some places, we're feeling extremely kind of dour and in a very bad mood.
As the dust settles, is there a tendency in this way of talking to people about sentiment, about how they're feeling, that people feel better when an election is in the rearview mirror? Is there a human tendency to say, whew, that's over, whether their guy won or not, whether their gal won or not? Do they just say, well, now let's start looking ahead? Does Donald Trump get a natural bump just from the way human beings are wired?
Trump is such a unique situation because he's been president before. So my guess is, does he get a small bump in a honeymoon or like, yeah, thank God that's behind us? I'm like, probably. I don't think it's going to be very long-lived. I think the way we remember, for those of us who really remember the Trump administration well, how long is it before we're back in what we were doing during the Trump administration? It's like, well, depending on what he does. But does it feel similar? My guess is it feels fairly similar. He could take more extreme actions. I will say, like, his last week or so on the campaign trail was really bizarre. He was really out there. The question is, does he rein some of that stuff in now? Was that really just he was exhausted and on the trail? I mean, we'll see. The one thing I think that we will get out of it in the work that we do with the American Communities Project is, to what you're saying, we had a hard time getting people talking to us last year, particularly when we went out to rural communities. You ran into this when you went out to do reporting.
You bet.
And my guess is it will be easier to talk to those people over the next couple of years because they won. They feel vindicated. So in terms of the work we do, look, if people don't talk to you, it's hard to understand what you can't understand what they're thinking. And I do think the one thing that comes out of this for our work is, look, these people should be willing to open up now. Talk to me. What are you really feeling? What do you really want? Because they're dealing in they think from a position of strength. Okay, that's a positive, because the one thing I will say is I don't know how we solve the challenges we have in this country, but it starts at least with us talking to each other. And if this group in particular has been very difficult to get to talk to us, and they should feel at this moment they won, they should feel free to say what's on their mind and open up. And that's something that I hope anyway. I don't know if it's like a more positive view of everything, but to your point, just the temperature comes down a little bit because the election's passed, especially for those who won. And they might be willing to really open up a little more, which would be a net positive in terms of trying to get into their minds.
One of the more fascinating aspects of the ACP surveys for me is the way Americans are feeling about each other and where they think that the cumulative effect of how they feel about each other. Are these people my countrymen? Do they understand me? Do they know me? Do I like them? What do I think of the places they live? We were told all through this election season that we were divided. The country's never been this divided. And you saw some of that in your numbers. You saw some of that in the way people imagine the life that's lived in other places that are removed from their experience. I wonder if the persistence of that is something that any leader who wants to be the chief executive of the United States has to take some account of.
You would think. I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I don't know. Like have we been more divided ever? We had a civil war. I mean, we've been a little more divided than this. But in modern history, have we been more divided than this? No. I mean, I've gone out and talked to people. I've never seen it like this before. I've never seen it like this. Look, the real question is, it's about the guy who's going to the Oval Office. Does he want to do that? How much does he want to govern? How much does he really want to get stuff done? And not just the Project 2025 stuff, which I will say, like, everybody's like, oh, they've got the House and the Senate. It's like, they don't have 60 votes in the Senate. They're not going to be close enough. It's like, the Senate is just going to become the sand in the gears of everything that they want to do. Does that mean they try to get rid of the filibuster? I don't know. But like, if he really wants to try to get something done, you're dealing with a divided country. You have to at least put your hand out to the other side and say like, hey, you may not agree with me, but can we find some common ground here? Does that sound like Donald Trump to me? It does not. But might we be surprised because there are some things that they feel they need to get done and they're going to have to reach across the aisle? Maybe. I mean, we're sifting through the rubble of the election and trying to understand what's in there. I think some of that we might know more in a month after Trump is kind of, look, he never is going to run for office again, right? That may mean that he's freed up to do whatever he wants, or it might mean that he wants to create a legacy. I'm not Donald Trump. I mean, but the idea that he's going to do some of these things we're talking about, it's try to cross the aisle, or at least reach across the aisle and do some stuff. I don't know. We're going to have to see. I mean, I would think if there's something really grand that you want to get accomplished, you're going to need a lot of support. But man, there's a lot of fences to mend before you get to that point. It feels like that because, there's a lot of hard feelings right now. And let's see where we are in a month, I guess, and then maybe I'll be able to answer that question a little better.
Dante Chinni is the director of the American Communities Project at Michigan State University. Great to talk to you, Dante.
Always good to see you, Ray.
For most of the year, election coverage has been obsessively focused on the 7 battleground states: Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. In 2020, Joe Biden defeated Donald Trump in all of them except North Carolina, but his margin of victory was razor thin. This is what made Kamala Harris vulnerable in 2024. She simply had no room for error. And the results? Harris failed in all 7 of the swing states, but the reasons why she lost Georgia may differ greatly from why she lost Pennsylvania. We turn to journalists in these 2 states to learn how Trump secured victory. Rahul Bali is a political reporter for WABE and host of the station's political podcast, Plugged In. He covers state politics, including the Georgia General Assembly, the governor, and other state leaders in offices. Welcome to On Shifting Ground, Rahul.
It's great to be on with you, Ray.
Well, Georgia was one of those places that was speculated about before Election Day as a place Kamala Harris had a shot in. What happened differently from what people were seeing in the polling?
So we're still digging into the numbers, Ray, but it seems like the polling was borne out, that this was going to be a really close state. Was it as close as the infamous 2020 election, which was decided by less than 12,000 votes? No. But when you look at the past history, kind of in the same ballpark as 2016. And I remind people that Georgia is a Republican state. That's my starting point. And that there is a path, obviously, what you saw with Joe Biden in 2020, what you've seen with Georgia's 2 Democratic U.S. senators, John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock, that there is a Democratic path depending on candidates and turnout. And you asked the question, what did or did not happen? One of the things we're looking at are Black voters here in the state of Georgia. Our partners at the Associated Press, the numbers from their exit polling of 115,000 voters across the country shows that there was a dip with Black voters for Vice President Harris, and that some of those went on to support former President Trump. So that's what we're looking at here as well when it comes to the state of Georgia.
There was a lot of seat-of-the-pants sociology being done in Georgia, and a lot of analysis of the way the state's population was changing. And the last time I was in Georgia, I was surprised but not shocked to see the concentration of new immigrants from various parts of the world in the Atlanta metro, very much more in evidence on the streets, in shopping malls. The Atlanta metro is a much more mixed place, along with an almost entirely native-born black population, this seemed to be a place that was tantalizingly changing in a way that seemed to offer Democrats a possibility. And you mentioned Warnock and Ossoff. Did the campaign, the Harris campaign, pay a lot of attention to that new Georgia?
Absolutely. You did see that outreach. But it's important to point out that Republicans, starting with the former president, have also been making that outreach with their candidates. You're seeing what's really changed in the past couple of years, Ray, is the Republican outreach to the Asian American community, to the Latino community, to the Black community, events aimed specifically at those communities. That's what I'm seeing here on the ground. And I'll give you an example. There's a mall here in this area called the Global Mall. It's an Indian American mall. I took my engagement pictures there. I go there on a regular basis. You see campaign events there. You saw Nikki Haley campaign there a couple of years ago. You see regular events there. You see but you of course see the outreach, Democratic candidates having events at bubble tea restaurants. That's what you're seeing here on both sides. So yes, the Harris campaign did put their time and focus in those communities, but you also saw more of it with the Republican side as well.
Georgia is often portrayed as the sort of symbol of the new South, modern economy, a place where people are moving from other parts of the country, a lot of new development in various metro centers in the state. Those would all seem to push the economy as one of the most salient issues. As you are looking at post-election Georgia, was that it? The economy? Was that like it is in other places?
Absolutely. Looking at the exit polling data, again, from the Associated Press, it by and far was the number one issue in the state of Georgia, was the economy. And people talked about that. For years, people talked about Georgia being a great place to move to because housing prices were so much lower for people who moved from other parts of the country. We're not seeing that as much anymore. And then the pocketbook issues absolutely ended up being a major issue across the state of Georgia because people in rural Georgia were paying those same high prices but making less money, obviously, because they're living outside the city center. So pocketbook issues were really a big deal.
How about immigration? How did that land in a state where so much of the population increase is either from people moving into the state who have moved to the United States from outside the country and their children who are growing up in Georgia? The sometimes ugly rhetoric against immigration that was coming out of the Republican campaign doesn't seem to have done Donald Trump much harm. When you go to a place like Dalton, which is now more than 50% Latino, when you go to a place like the Atlanta metro with increasing Latin American and Asian populations, do you have to thread the needle when you engage in heavily emotional immigration-based appeals in your politics?
So let me share a few thoughts on this, Ray. Let me start with the rallies of former President Donald Trump. These were the largest applause lines. These got the biggest cheers, the anti-immigrant rhetoric. And going back to the data with the Associated Press, while it wasn't as big of an issue as the economy, in terms of intensity, about how much more it mattered in 2024 than 2020, immigration was the highest. It was the one that moved up in terms of intensity more than any other issue. And let me share a conversation I had in Macon, Georgia, at Donald Trump's final campaign rally before Election Day. And I spoke to a Mexican-American immigrant. She had come here when she was younger. She joined the military, became an American citizen. And she talked about that. Look, there are those who feel like there was a right way, a legal way to do it, and that others weren't doing it that way. And that was one of the reasons she was backing Donald Trump. Now, on the Democratic side, they pointed out that language and pointed out to the communities, look, this is what the former president's saying, and this is what could happen. It seems like the issues around immigration, the issues around economy outweighed some of that rhetoric in the end.
One of the things that makes that interesting is that Georgia is one of those places where economic growth has attracted immigrants, but also immigrants are part of that economic growth. A couple of cycles ago, I was at the Republican National Convention talking with a delegate who didn't want me to use his name. He's a home builder in the Atlanta metro. And I asked him if he had undocumented people on his work sites, and he said, yeah, I have to admit it, yeah, because I can't get anybody else to pound in roof tiles in July in Atlanta besides Mexicans.
Ray, the immigrant population is critical for some of those industries. The poultry industry here in the state of Georgia, the agriculture industry as a whole, those are critical. And it's going to be interesting to see how Republicans try to balance that. You mentioned Dalton. That area is represented in the state house by a Republican. But he's one of those who's trying to strike that balance of, for example, in-state tuition for kids who went to high school here but may not be citizens. He's one of those Republicans who's going to trying to strike that balance. And you're going to have to see what happens with Republicans in Georgia, because the business climate here in this state is something that they promote a lot in Georgia. And if there comes challenges, how is that all going to be balanced out? It is something I'm definitely watching, Ray.
Rahul Bali is the host of Plugged In, political podcast for public station WABE. He covers the Georgia state government and joined us from Atlanta. Good to talk to you, Rahul.
Great to talk to you, Ray.
You're listening to On Shifting Ground, produced by Commonwealth Club World Affairs in San Francisco. Coming up, we talk to a journalist in Pennsylvania about what went so wrong for the Harris campaign there. Katie Meyer is a government editor and reporter for Spotlight PA. She covers government and elections with a focus on how money and powerful interests shape policy decisions and the way those decisions affect Pennsylvanians. And Katie, wow, a lot of money must have been spent in Pennsylvania in the last 120 days.
An enormous amount of money, yes.
Did it really change anything?
It's a good question. In the presidential race, it's hard to say. I mean, Harris's ground game was more robust than Donald Trump's was, a little bit more organized. Her door knockers were everywhere, and that stuff all costs money. But obviously in Pennsylvania, that's not what broke through. So money gets you somewhere, but I don't think it gets you everywhere.
Well, when we look at Pennsylvania, there are a lot of counties that voted for Joe Biden in 2020, that voted for Donald Trump in 2024. What should people listening in other places in America know about Pennsylvania and the sort of state of play in 2024 that helps them understand that result?
Yeah. I think the thing that is clear in Pennsylvania is in many ways the thing that's clear in lots of states right now, which is just that Trump made inroads in many parts of the state with many kinds of people. When you look at the places where turnout shifted, but more just that the vote share shifted toward Republicans, it's almost everywhere. In Pennsylvania, you saw it in Philadelphia. I've been looking pretty specifically at Philadelphia. That's a place where I think Democrats, they take it for granted that they're going to get a lot of votes there and that those votes are going to go for Democrats. And that's still the case. Of course, that's still the case. But if you look at what we're seeing, and again, I'm going to caveat this, that we do not have final vote counts. So things are going to shift and things are going to get a little bit more concrete. But Democrats outnumber Republicans 7-1 in Philly. Turnout went down a little bit from 2020, but not that much. It was around 66% then. It looks like it's probably going to be between 62, 63 now. But the vote share really changed. So Harris got around 78, 79% of votes in Philadelphia, and Trump got 20%. That's about the worst. Actually, I'll attribute this to the Philadelphia Inquirer. They reported that this morning. That's like the worst a Democrat has done in Philly in about 20 years, if that number holds. So I would say that political patterns in Pennsylvania and in other places, they're not forever. They do shift. And so you've seen these like recent trends where, Philly's still this repository of votes for Democrats, or the Philly suburbs every year finds more votes for Democrats. They seem to have found a little bit of a ceiling in the suburbs, and in Philadelphia, their vote share has gone down.
The old idea that you campaign hard to run up totals in Pittsburgh in the west and Philadelphia and surrounding counties in the east, the Democrats used that playbook. Every time I turned on the television, there she was in one of those counties or another. It seemed not to break through, but Trump's been president before. Were those years so good in Pennsylvania that there was a yearning to go back to them?
I talked to many voters in the lead up to this election, and there was this perception. I'm not saying that it's accurate on all measures. A lot of people will talk about how, the economy is good right now. Unemployment is low. The pandemic is over. And I think that, of course, those are all true. But for a lot of voters who were on the fence or who were the kind of person that you could persuade to vote one way or another, I was getting the feeling that this was, to many of them, a change election, the kind of election where an incumbent or the vice president of the incumbent kind of has an uphill battle. And it's funny to have a change election against a person who is not the incumbent and a person who used to be president who is like the change candidate. But that is how a lot of people who I talked to were thinking about it. So to your question, were those times so good that people wanted to go back to them? Not everyone, not every kind of person. But yeah, I think that was the overwhelming feeling that I was getting from talking to voters. And again, it's not an assessment of whether that's like correct or whether everybody thought that way, but clearly it was a message that was resonating, that things were better 4 years ago. We're going to get back there.
It's interesting to me that several days out from the election, you're still talking in a speculative way about where things are going to be when they are finalized. Is this a hangover from 2020? Why is the count in Pennsylvania so slow and not yet finished?
So first off, yeah, I think the way that I'm talking about it is a little bit of a 2020 hangover where we truly didn't have results for days and days. I'm couching things within an inch of my life because God, I don't know, stuff could change. We have most of the results now. We mostly know what happened. We have one county where we haven't gotten all the votes counted, and that's just because they had issues the day of the election. They had some technical problems. But I will say, yeah, Pennsylvania does count things very slowly. We had widespread vote by mail for the first time in 2020. We had a new law that was passed in 2019. And so that year, results were very slow. And it was because largely, it was just a very close election. But B, people were unfamiliar with mail voting. We have a law that permits us to only start counting mail ballots on the day of the election. Most states that have this can do it sooner. So it was a combination of those factors, as well as a Supreme Court ruling that had kept us accepting mail votes until 4 days after the election that year. So all that to say, I think we're scared to be too concrete about the results that are coming in because stuff is still missing. I don't like starting to do demographic analysis or anything like that until I really know what the vote totals are, until provisional ballots are counted. But yeah, by and large, it's clear what happened here. Trump just made inroads in most places. And I think that's something that figuring out exactly what happened takes time, but the broad strokes are there.
Katie Meyer is a government editor and reporter for Spotlight PA. Thanks for joining us on Shifting Ground.
No, it's my pleasure.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you, with special support from Mark and Maury Jane Perry, and Ann and Greg Avis. Today's episode was produced, mixed, and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.